For 10 years, she kept a little book. It was the size of a pocket prayer book, its pages soft with handling, its spine taped where it had been broken and mended more than once. Soledad Ramírez carried it like contraband, folded into the hem of an apron, slid beneath a cushion, hidden behind a row of recipe cards. When she closed the front door of her house on Calle del Árbol in Tlaquepaque and turned the key, the house held its breath. Cool shadows under the beamed ceilings, the slow tick of a wall clock, a photograph on the mantel where 3 faces smiled, frozen and unbroken. Nobody guessed the photograph had been moved and repositioned more than once to conceal a scratch, a tear, a line of guilt. The sun in that alley seared like lead poured from a ladle. Teja roofs sent back heat in waves. Bougainvilleas draped the courtyard fence in strips of bruised magenta, their petals curled from lack of water. A pot of pozole simmered sometimes on weekends in the house next door, the scent leaking through a cracked window and mixing with the ordinary odors of Soledad's life. Lemon oil on floorboards, soap, the dry, faint smell of lilies left too long on a side table. She knew every sound the house made. She could tell, blindfolded, which floorboard would creak if you crossed the hallway, which hinge complained. For Soledad, routine was a sanctuary and a snare. Cleaning was a rhythm that kept thought from climbing into the shape of confession. The ritually scrubbed tile was a story she could control. Widowed for nearly 20 years, she had raised Roberto with a rigid, anxious devotion. He had been a child who did not cry easily. He worked as an engineer, late nights and long drives, a man who loved bolts, plans, and the quiet hum of machines more than people sometimes. He loved his mother too, tenderly in the small ways we mean love that is a habit more than a choice. Claudia had entered their lives like a wind. She laughed loud, cooked with thrown-together spices, folded towels so they seemed to belong to the home itself. She bore 2 children in quick succession, Miguelito, with his father's dark, solemn brow, and Sofia, with her mother's quick, careless grin. The house had once been full of small noises that stitched it together, spoon against bowl, pants pulled onto little legs, loud arguments that were more like storms and passed like afternoons. Soledad watched that life with mixed eyes. She had been proud. She had been afraid. Fear, for Soledad, was a tide that crept and then swallowed. It began with a simple thought, what if Roberto left me? And then grew its own reasons. She told herself she was protecting him, protecting the family. A whispered concern about a forgotten vaccination. An anxious phone call to Roberto in the middle of his workday. Are you sure your wife remembered the papers for the clinic? Little alerts sent like fishing line into a marriage she did not live inside. Each concern she raised was wrapped in the language of love. Each suspicion was a thread she pulled tighter until the tapestry began to fray. The notebook began as a place to record details, appointments, birthdays, the names of neighbors who owed money. Then an entry appeared that read like a ledger of worry. June 12. Claudia let the baby cry. She says she was busy. Soledad underlined it. Her hand trembled the first time she added an adjective next to Claudia's name, negligent. Over months, adjectives became accusations. One discreet observation at a church luncheon, a misplaced casserole, a shrug at a child's plea, became a paragraph in the book, written in a hand that smudged fast when she cried, and then dried hard when she hardened herself. She did not think of it as a weapon at first. She told herself she was recording facts. If someday something went wrong, there would be a sheet to point to, a clean, ordered account. The lie was not a single dramatic act. It was a series of tiny pushes, an accumulation of grit in a joint until it ground down. Soledad called Roberto from the job site to say the bank had called and showed a false balance, hinting at a missing withdrawal. She ran her fingers across Claudia's blouse and said, "Has she been staying out late?" and let her voice curl around the truth until it sounded like concern. At family meals, she brought up trifles as evidence. The children looked tired the other day, and let Roberto's worry do the rest. He, who had always wanted to be needed, leaned in. As time passed, Soledad's statements began to look less like concerned notes and more like a manuscript of sabotage. She would photograph a dish left on the counter, a toy under the table, and keep the picture in the notebook with a caption, "Neglect." She would stage small scenes to confirm her suspicions, timing Claudia as she moved through the house, noting the minutes between entries and exits. The pen recorded what she had decided to be true. Claudia, for her part, was not distant. She kept a fierce tenderness in the way she folded the children's clothes, and in the way she hummed at dawn. She had a mothering that was neither perfect nor negligent. She made mistakes and made amends. But the notebook had a habit of turning mistakes into proof. When Claudia forgot to sign Roberto's lunchbox note because she'd been awake all night with Sofia, Soledad saw the forgetfulness as a pattern. She told Roberto. She showed him the note. He saw a pattern too, where none existed, because what we look for is what we find. There were early cracks. A tense exchange in a grocery line about a missed phone call, a remark that seemed to come from the same sorrowful place as a prayer. Roberto began defending his mother. Love can be a blind eye. He threadbarely navigated a world where his loyalties split. Meetings at work grew longer. He began to pick disputes with Claudia that had the texture of Soledad's complaints more than of his wife's actions. The children sensed the discomfort. Sometimes they clung to Claudia with an urgent protectiveness their age could not name. The first time Soledad wrote the word betrayal in the notebook, it felt like a just sentence to her. It felt like a verdict she had been appointed to pronounce. She underlined the date, as if holiness required punctuation. She did not imagine the paper would one day be used as evidence. She imagined it would keep watch, a kind of guardian ledger, proof for herself that she had not been foolish. For a long while, this was private labor. She would sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold and add notes, smoothing the page with a fingertip as if the ink might scald. When she relayed the entries to Roberto, she always delivered them with a tremor that seemed to plead innocence. "I worry, hijo. I only want what is best for you." His jaw would tighten, his voice would lower. He would tell himself she was right, or that she was lonely, or that their life had become complicated, and then he would return to the marriage unfinished. The notebook did not glamorize her. It made her meticulous. It created patterns that hid inside the family's days. It explained her sleeplessness, coded her life with purpose, and slowly carved a moat between Claudia and her home. Words scrawled in blue ink changed the geometry of a household. Then the small things began to escalate. A grocery list copied from Claudia's handwriting that Soledad claimed was evidence of erratic planning. A photograph of a day at the park cropped to avoid showing Sofia laughing in Claudia's arms. A note about school fees where Soledad had erased another line to make it look like the payment had been tardy. Each alteration was a small, deliberate violence. Soledad sat alone at her table and justified each tweak in a soliloquy of fear. If I do not, who will? If I point out, maybe they will see and fix it. The acts had the patina of righteousness. The sin lay in the steady filing of the falsehood. The work of distortion is patient. It does not announce itself with trumpets. It waits like rot, and then the structure bends. Family conversations turned into interrogations. Roberto, who had a boy's loyalty to the woman who raised him, began to divide his time into meetings, calls, and last-minute dinners in sterile restaurants. Claudia grew weary. The children's laughter receded into the rooms more and more seldom. Once, in the churchyard, Doña Esperanza, who would later become one of Soledad's few stabilizing contacts, caught Soledad watching Claudia and the children from a distance. "You look like you carry the heat of the sun in your chest," Doña Esperanza said. Soledad only smiled and said, "I am careful." She said it like a prayer.
Doña Esperanza, who had seen many things under the tiled roofs of Tlaquepaque, said, "Care is one thing, control is another." Soledad replied with a line that, in retrospect, read like a confession. "I only want them safe."
Small evidence accumulated. A bank account irregularity Soledad claimed to have called about, notes about negligence, overheard comments on Claudia's parenting. Perhaps the most damning of all the items in the notebook were the entries that narrated motive. She wants him to leave me. She wants the house. Things that were not facts but projections of Soledad's terrors. When fear writes motive for others, it is already making a judgment. The day Roberto found the notebook, it was a humid afternoon. He was changing the sheets in the guest room because Miguelito had stayed the night at his grandmother's house. A towel fell against the closet door and knocked the book into view, an act of domestic gravity. He picked it up out of habit, out of a curiosity that had worn a small edge over the years. The book opened to a page where sentences flowed like a current, dates, small accusations, photographs with captions, names circled, times annotated. His face turned slow in the reading light. The small, familiar town of his mother's handwriting suddenly became an archive of sabotage. He could feel the sum of weeks pressed into the margins. The ink had become evidence heavier than any moment of confrontation he had imagined. In the corner of the final page, in a different pen, probably written later, the words that felt like a verdict. "If I cannot keep him, I will make him need me." He did not go to the living room. He did not say anything loud. It was as if a small machine wound tight at the center of him and then snapped. He went to the study and sat down at the table where he and Claudia had once spread maps of future vacations and lists of supplies. He dialed her number with the hands of someone performing an act whose morality he had been practicing half his life. Claudia answered. When he spoke, the words were a measured collapse. He said, "We need to talk. Now." Confrontation is often not an explosion, but a long, ragged negotiation. In the kitchen where the morning light leaned across the sink, Soledad stood washing dishes when Roberto came home and set the notebook down between her hands in the soap. Her movement stilled like a bird at the snap of a net. The book looked smaller there, defenseless in a way she had not allowed herself to be. She tried to explain, her voice a river of practiced argument. "It isn't what it looks like," she said at first, which was true only in the sense that what it looked like was far worse than she had felt it to be. Roberto asked questions that were sharp because they were simple. "Why did you write that? Why did you change the photograph? Why did you call me that day and say the bank had been contacted?" Her answers came out like the business of a person who had been employed by fear for too long. "I worried. I wrote what I saw. I wanted to protect you." She did not name the intentionality of the erasures. She did not say, "I wanted her gone." She couldn't. Claudia did not storm in with a dramatic accusation. She sat down at the table and began to cry in a way that had no theatricality, only the honest depletion of a woman who had been misunderstood for years. The children, then, walked in from school, and Miguelito's nose was red and small when he looked at the book and the faces that had become too heavy to live with. Divorce papers were signed with a bureaucratic efficiency that made the collapse feel official. Roberto moved out with things packed into a small U-Haul borrowed from a cousin. The house that had once contained 3 different kinds of music, mechanical, maternal, domestic, went quiet. That quiet was a kind of punishment. Word travels fast in a town like Tlaquepaque, where neighbors share tomatoes and secrets with equal generosity. There were notes slid under Soledad's gate, a polite distance from the woman who had been at the center of so many family gatherings. Graffiti appeared on the wall of her house one night in a spray of paint, Traidora, a label that bruised deeper than any public act of shaming. Her phone, which once lit up with calls from distant cousins and old schoolmates, began to blink less. People who had once waved at her across the mercado now crossed the plaza. Loneliness in a small town is a felt thing. It crowds the air. She tried to make amends in the only way she knew. She cleaned more, scrubbed the steps until they shone, as if purity could be found under elbow grease. She attended Mass and sat near the back, stealing glances at the faces who whispered. She tried to call Roberto, but his voice over the phone was a measured frost. "I can't do this anymore, Mama," he said finally. It was not a shout, but a closing of a door. The absence of his footsteps became its own kind of violence. Months folded into an indifferent sameness. The house put on the coat of time. The bougainvilleas drooped and did not revive. Her appetite dimmed. She found herself waking at night and replaying the notebook in her hands, its pages crisp against her knuckles. Sometimes she would imagine the past as if rewinding a film, but the images were always edited through her memory, which preferred scenes where she had acted out of love. The notebook, however, had a way of showing things she did not want to see. A photograph of Miguelito with a scrapped me that she had captioned "Mother Neglect," though in the picture, Claudia was kneeling beside him with both arms around the child. The photographs had the cruelty of being evidence of the very thing she had wanted to prevent. It is a peculiar cruelty to be hated for an act you have convinced yourself was for the best. The neighbor's avoidance landed like cold rain. The postman, a man who greeted every porch with small conversation, began to place her letters in a different pile. A graffiti artist had tagged her house. A senior group at church voted to rotate the soup kitchen schedule to exclude the woman who had become a scandal. People are expedient with their ostracism, and in a small town, social exile is a punishable commodity. Soledad started to have trouble breathing, not from any ailment, but from the constant pressing inward of shame. She would sit at the window and watch children pass with school bags and feel their normalcy as something that had been stolen. There were nights she prayed with the specificity of someone bargaining. "God, if he only listens, if they would only see." The prayers did not comfort for long. They were murmurs in a house that had become a reliquary of regret. She went to see Father Mateo because guilt needs a confessional sometimes, and confession feeds the soul grammar of repair. He listened, palms folded, his face an open place for mercy. "You must tell the truth," he said, "not as a threat, but as a road. You must name what you have done and accept what follows." His words were not a promise that he could fix what had been broken. They were a summons to accountability. Soledad nodded and promised to write everything. She meant it, and the notebook that had once chronicled every perceived slight began to be the same instrument of self-judgment. But the community's response did not turn with the same speed as contrition. The social cost was heavy. The children had been wounded. Miguelito's drawings had been different after that year, his figures smaller, his smiles less frequent. Sophia began asking why her father stayed away, and Claudia's answers were patient and sparse. It's complicated. Children absorb the world and give it meaning in ways adults rarely notice until the patterns are set. Soledad fell into a slow reel of small tasks and smaller regrets, her hands leaving faint smudges on plates and panes because her mind had become something else entirely. She would pray and then count the times she had lied. She would pant through a night and wake up thinking of the words she had written in a tone that made her sound like a villain she did not remember at all. The difference between her inner narration and the public story widened until it felt like an ocean. Isolation can do strange things to decision-making. It can tint the moral colors of actions until black seems like a reasonable shade. One morning she woke with a hunger that was not for food, but for an end to the noise. It was not melodramatic, not theatrical. It was the slow surrender of someone exhausted. She put a handful of pills on the kitchen table, not to write a great drama of despair, but to quiet the echo of her choices. She lay down on the bed with the light of late afternoon slanting through the blinds and thought of photographs and of the children and of the years that had been reduced to pages. There are, however, moments where narrative chooses to pause and someone else steps into the frame. The radio ticked softly in the corner.
Outside, a little boy's bike skidded across the cobblestones, and the sound of laughter rose and then fell into the distance.
Soledad's hand hovered over the pills like a pen poised above a confession. She thought of the long line of Sundays she had lost to petty distrust. She thought of Roberto's face when he read the notebook, how the light left his eyes, and how something in him had rearranged itself into grief and anger. 3 knocks came at the door. The sound was not loud, it was deliberate. There are different qualities to a knock. Some are frantic, some are casual, and some are the kind that seem to arrive with their own gravity, with their own rightness. These were neither frantic nor casual, they were measured, as if whoever stood on the other side understood the old house and knew exactly what it took to disturb the air. Soledad did not move for a long moment. The pills lay on the table like a testimony of a woman who had lost the ability to believe in her own goodness. The house itself seemed to hold its breath. The knock came again, 3 firm beats that arranged themselves into a rhythm that might be an invitation or a command. Her mind skittered to explanations. Neighbors who had finally decided to come and castigate her, some energetic parishioner with a casserole, perhaps Roberto himself with a final resolution. She swung her feet off the bed and walked to the door, each step an act of will. The hallway light sliced her profile into a thin, familiar silhouette. When she opened the door, the man standing there did not look like anyone in the town's small registry of busybodies. He was not dressed like parish priests or the market men she knew. He wore a tunic that fell simply, as if it were a garment from another age, but not foreign. The fabric had the kind of plainness that made you notice the face instead. He was barefoot on the cobbles, as if the stones themselves were not an enemy. He looked too calm to be ordinary calm. There was a depth in his eyes that suggested an understanding of things beyond what the town expected to encounter. Soledad felt like someone in the front row of a small theater, suddenly realizing they had left the headlamp on and could now see every imperfection on the stage of their life. The man said one thing. He did not throw the notebook into the street. He did not point fingers. He said, simply, "May I come in?" She had 100 answers to refuse. She found herself stepping aside, as if invited into a silence she could not name. The house seemed to exhale when he crossed the threshold. The radio continued its domestic program. The wall clock clicked. The man did not look around the way a stranger might. He looked at Soledad. The look was neither condemnation nor approval. It was the steady, unflinching regard of someone who had all the time in the world to listen to the truth. Some people would later call him a visitor from God. Others would describe him as an apparition. Some neighbors, when told, could not reconcile their memory with their theology.
Soledad, at that first instant, knew only that the presence halted her breath, and that the house felt less like a prison and more like a place where a verdict could be read and perhaps, if mercy were present, rewritten. She led him to the kitchen table where the open notebook lay like a small black pit. It was a thing she had used to catalog other people's failures, and now it cataloged her own. The man sat down across from her without touching the book. He folded his hands on the table and waited as if the next act was not his to lead, but hers to begin. "Who are you?" Soledad asked, though her voice had the quality of someone asking a question knowing the answer and hoping it was different. The man smiled, and the smile was not the sort that patched things over. It was restful and sure, a smile that contained both kindness and an insistence that things be seen for what they were. "My name is not what matters," he said. "What matters is that you see what you have done." It would be easy in a stripped-down retelling to make this moment into an immediate collapse and conversion. The more human truth is that Soledad's mind, trained in the grammar of defense, moved fast to policy. She told him what she had always told others. She worried, she protected, she had been afraid. The man's gaze did not soften into pity. It waited like a bell at the center of a chapel, unmoving until stood in.
He reached toward the old television in the corner, and, with no more theatrics than a man switching on a lamp, he touched the knob. The screen flared, not with static or a channel feed, but with images that seemed to come from the room itself. Memories replayed, as if the air between the teja roof and the floorboards had been a film strip. Soledad's heart lodged. The pictures on the screen were not flattering. They were small scenes she had lived and then rewritten in her mind. She watched herself at her kitchen table, younger, sharper, writing an entry and smudging out a line. She watched Claudia at the sink, the kids at play, Roberto reading a flyer and folding it into his pocket. The images were not accusatory in tone. They were simple and precise. They did not judge, they showed. She had always been able to avoid seeing herself in full. The photographs on the screen made avoidance impossible. He did not say much. When he did speak, the words were short and clear. "You chose," he said, as if in the recounting of a legal matter, and yet there was no triumph in his voice. "Now you must face what you chose." Soledad felt the weight of the sentence as if someone had placed a stone on her sternum. There was no scolding flourish, no thundering judgment. The truth, when placed plainly before a person, has its own bluntness. The television images continued to roll. They were not complete footage, but enough to show patterns that her notebook had backed up. The staging of a scene, the intentional cropping of a photo, a call at noon. She had always been able to avoid seeing herself in full. The photographs on the screen made avoidance impossible. He did not say much. When he did speak, the words were short and clear. "You chose," he said, as if in the recounting of a legal matter, and yet there was no triumph in his voice. "Now you must face what you chose." Soledad felt the weight of the sentence, as if someone had placed a stone on her sternum. There was no scolding flourish, no thundering judgment. The truth, when placed plainly before a person, has its own bluntness. The television images continued to roll. They were not complete footage, but enough to show patterns that her notebook had backed up. The staging of a scene, the intentional cropping of a photo, a call at noon. The film showed a truth she had been too clever to admit. Her first instinct was to deny the clarity she saw. "It's not as you say," she began, but the images were patient and uncooperative with her defenses. Each scene countered the narratives she had lived inside. Each replay of a photograph pointed not to malice, perhaps, but to a deliberate campaign of misinterpretation. Watching herself, she could see the quiet satisfaction she had taken in being the person who knew more than others. It was like watching a stranger make choices you could not excuse. When he spoke again, his voice was not cold. "Confession is not a performance," he said. "Confession is naming. Say what you have done. Name it by its truth, not by your fear." The man's words were short and tender, like counsel in a confessional that did not belong to a particular parish, but to the common human need to be honest. Soledad's hands, those hands that had scrubbed and sewed and cooked, now trembled as she picked up a pen. The pen hovered over a fresh page in the notebook. The act of writing was small but monumental. She wrote the date, and then a sentence with all the heaviness of one who has been given a task that cannot be deferred. The sentences that followed were not a defense. They were not an appeal. They were a listing. The things she had done, the alterations, the motives she had allowed to live inside her. Her handwriting shook, and sometimes she erased and started again. The man watched, but he did not rush her. Outside, the town moved as towns do. A taxi rattled past, a dog barked at the corner. Inside the house, the air gathered into a single frequency of truth. She wrote for a long time. When the last line was written, and her confession sat on the page like an unveiled thing, she closed the book and felt a small, terrible relief. Relief because the act of telling had some weight off her chest.
terrible because the act of telling could not undo the harm. The man looked at her with something that was not sorrow, but an acknowledgement. "Do you understand," he said, "that confession is not the same as repair?" She did. She had been to the priest. She had sat through whispered advice and had written the thing down. She had pledged to do what was right. But understanding intellectually and bearing the consequence were different. She felt them both pressing down on her like two hands. He moved as if about to leave, but then he stopped and turned back as if a final instruction had come to him. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud. It was the voice of someone who gives direction because the other must be able to choose. "Make what you must of it," he said. "Answer what you can. Be honest with them. And be prepared. Not all will agree to come home." The sentence was a small sermon. It was a warning and a mercy. He did not promise that saying the truth would bring restoration. He only insisted that without the truth there could be no possibility of repair.
"Do the work of truth," he added, "and let the rest be for God and for those you have hurt." He did not promise reconciliation. He refused to reduce ethics to a transactional formula. It was, in its humble way, a liberation and a condemnation together. Soledad sat with the confession like a small animal she had caught, something she could not throw back into the wild. There was a heaviness, an anticipation shaped like a cliff. The man rose then and walked toward the door. The house had resumed, almost reluctantly, its ordinary noises. The man paused with his hand on the knob and looked back. "One more thing," he said, and the words arrived like something simple and enormous. "Tell them, do not make them find it." He left before she could reply, and when the door shut, the sound was small and final. Soledad sat at the table with the notebook open and the pen still in her hand. She felt as if the air had been cleared by a broom someone else had wielded, leaving the rooms brighter and the corners sharper. What came after was not cinematic reconciliation. It was a messy, painfully real process. She wrote and then she mailed. She walked to the post office and pressed the envelope into the clerk's hand with an unsteady thumb, asking for certified return receipt with the small, bureaucratic diligence of one who knew how to follow through. The clerk looked at her with the mild curiosity reserved for regulars. Her hands smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. She left the envelopes with the air of someone trying to do what right seemed to require. News moves differently in small towns. The certified letters arrived with the emotional weight of summonses. Roberto read the confession with a face that did not betray its turmoil, but which changed as if something inside him had been untied. Claudia was in the kitchen when the envelope arrived. She read the lines and then slid down against the wall, the letter crumpled in her lap like a discarded thing. She did not pick up the phone. She, like many who are hurt, needed to sit with the news on her own terms. Soledad began attending a small support group at the church basement, a room with folding chairs and a kettle and a poster about forgiveness that read like a promise in miniature. Doña Esperanza sat with her in the group and offered tea, and nods that carried the weight of someone who had learned to live with other people's mistakes. They read stories about making amends, and listened to the leader talk about restitution and the slow work of trust. The therapy sessions were not a magic panacea. They were, as she would later admit, a scaffold. She learned terms, attachment, anxious care, patterns, and they gave names to the things that had guided her actions. But names do not erase harm. They only offer understanding. Understanding did not bring back the night Roberto had left, the quiet house, the children's altered drawings. It offered a path forward if one could keep walking it. Soledad tried. She learned to sit with silence without filling it with accusation. She practiced listening when others told their stories. Months passed. She scrubbed fewer things to erase guilt and more to make her days mean something. She started to volunteer small hours at the parish soup kitchen, working beside women who greeted her without the brutal memory of the notebook because they had their own. She attended Mass, and the back pew no longer felt like a place to hide, but a place to be present. She wrote letters, long, clumsy apologies that did not expect return. But the world is a ledger of actions and consequences. Mailing a confession is not a guarantee of healing. The children still carried different stories to school. Neighbors' voices softened, but did not forget. The house lost value when sprayed with graffiti. Social exclusion is not a thing undone by contrition alone. Soledad learned, in the cold economy of repair, that honesty required sacrifice beyond the simple act of telling. One afternoon, when the air had begun to cool and the seasonal rains were a possibility, Soledad received a postcard with Roberto's new address written in a neat, unfamiliar hand. He had accepted the envelope. The return receipt had come back with his signature. It was not forgiveness. It was not even a conversation. It was a step. She clung to the smallness of that step like a drowning person to a spar. Then came the phone call she had both wanted and feared. Roberto asked for the money she had always kept aside at the back of a closet. A small portion of savings he needed to float his business through a slow season. The request was practical and not lodged in moral calculus. Soledad hesitated, knowing the money could be seen as an attempt to buy goodwill, but also knowing there were things she could do that would actually help. She sent the funds, not to purchase forgiveness, but to place a resource where it might be useful. It was not restitution, it was an act of responsibility. Yet even that could not stitch the wound closed. The town continued to whisper. The graffiti was scrubbed off, but the memory remained. Claudia did not write back, and weeks became months. Soledad found herself sometimes walking past the parque where children chased soccer balls and thinking of Miguelito's small hand in hers and how the image had become both balm and accusation. At night, she would lie awake and hear the small sounds of the house, the pipe that rattled, the wind against the shutters, and remember the knock at the door like a hinge that had been shifted. She had expected the man to be a judge. He had been something she could neither identify nor lay into a Sunday homily. He had asked her to name and had not guaranteed what would come next. And so the house settled into a new rhythm. Confession on the table, silence in the rooms, small acts of service at the parish.
The notebook remained out in the open, a dark thing that had become, paradoxically, both a tool of her sabotage and a ledger of her repentance. She began to teach herself to wait, an area of moral practice she had never enjoyed. Waiting was a new discipline. She had practiced it in kitchens, at bedside vigils, and finally in the slow weeks of repair. Then, one night, when the sky had the soft, bruise color of a storm on the horizon and the air smelled like wet earth and something like possibility, Soledad found herself at a point she had told herself she would never reach. The hollow in her chest had not healed, and there was a weariness that was not the kind cured by sleep. She made a small, private plan to make the noise stop. This time it wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, sad, practical, a folding into nothing. She sat at the kitchen table with the pills and the bottle from the cabinet and the list of things she would not be able to do tomorrow. It was a private ledger again, the old habit returning, but this time aimed inward. The house hummed. Outside, someone's radio played a song that had no lyrics she could catch. Her hands trembled. Then came a knock. 3 measured knocks at the front door. They landed like punctuation in the room's long sentence. She set the bottle down and listened. Her chest wanted to rise and run. Her mind wanted to stay and bear. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and walked toward the door with a heaviness that felt like gravity. The second knock sounded like an invitation. The third landed like a demand. She opened the door and found, again, a calm stranger standing there on the threshold, the kind of calm that quietly rearranges the geometry of possibility. The man on the threshold did not move like someone who expected thanks. He stood as if he had always been waiting there, his bare feet planted on the cool stones of the stoop, the edges of his tunic catching the light. For a moment Soledad simply looked at him and felt an exhaustion so complete it was almost luminous. Her confession still lay open on the table, an act already performed, but something in the way the stranger's eyes held hers suggested that naming had only started the work. He stepped inside with the soft, unobtrusive gait of someone who knew how to enter a house without upsetting its architecture. He did not look at the notebook. He looked at her. "You have told them," he said. She answered before thinking. "I sent the letters. I walked to the post office and waited while the clerk stamped them. I signed for the receipts." Her voice caught. "That is what the priest said. Tell them. I did." He nodded, small and patient. "Good," he said. "There is more to do." The line landed like a stone. It was not an accusation. It was an invitation. Soledad felt again the thin, brittle hope that had confused itself with a kind of pride in the telling. She clutched the kitchen chair with both hands as if it might steady her. "What more?" she asked.
He crossed to the old television and set his hand on the knob. The screen ignited with the same quiet clarity as before. Scenes from her life that were both hers and not wholly under her control. This time the images moved forward, faster, stitched with small moments she had not yet had the courage to face. A calendar page she had torn out and hidden. A hospital form she had not signed for a child's checkup. Roberto counting change at the counter of his workshop, with a look that was neither wholly bitter nor wholly content. The film, if she could call it that, did not dramatize. It simply placed moments side by side until the pattern could be read. "You see what your choices made possible," he said. "Now choose what you will make of what you see." The words were spare. They were like rails laid alongside the path she had been walking blindly. Soledad, who had kept the ledger of others' small faults and called it protection, felt suddenly like a woman at the edge of a bridge deciding whether to step back or to cross. The man spoke again, and his voice was neither pleading nor punitive. "Repair is costly," he said. "Some things will not be returned. Some wounds remain. But truth requires sacrifice. Repair requires restitution. Name what can be given, and then give it." Soledad felt the names of numbers enter her head. Her savings hidden in the wardrobe. The small account with the handwritten ledger in the bottom drawer. The gold coin Roberto had once given her after a job well done. The knowledge of what she had was a small, private arithmetic she had not needed until now. The house itself was part of that arithmetic. The adobe walls and teja roof had an appraised value and a story in equal measure. She had never imagined the house as currency. "You want me to sell the house?" she said, the sentence like a confession and a question. "No," the man said. "I want you to offer what you can as restitution. Let your hands do what your words have begun. Do it without expectation, without bargaining. Do it because it is right." Soledad's chest tightened. The idea of selling the home where she had kept her husband's memories, where she had scrubbed the pans and tucked blankets into beds, felt like a sacrilege and a salvation at once. There were other needs. Her health had dimmed into a small worry she pretended not to name. The doctor had mentioned a murmur, an irregularity that might require care. The thought of a surgery bill, of another ledger of hospital receipts, pressed on her. But as she looked at the man, she heard again the earlier sentence. Confession is not repair. She had been told to do what she must. This could be what must be done. She left the house that afternoon with a small canvas bag, and the sensation of being both impoverished and strangely light. Doña Esperanza met her at the mercado and reached for her hand. "You look like someone who has finally given a piece of herself away," she said. Soledad did not answer easily. The work of telling had been public. The work of giving would be quieter and lonelier. At the notary's office, the house appraisal felt like an inventory of memory. The man who came to inspect the rooms measured them and noted the cracks in the plaster with the professional indifference of someone accustomed to other people's lives being reduced to numbers. A buyer emerged, not a wealthy developer, but a young couple from Guadalajara who wanted to restore the garden and raise their children near the old church.
They spoke of bugambillas and of afternoons at the plaza. Their hope felt like a balm and a wound. Negotiations were modest and brisk. Soledad signed papers that required her thumbprint and the stamp of the municipality. She watched her name on the deeds move like a coin from one palm to another. She remembered a phrase Father Mateo had once said, "Restitution is not a transaction, it is a surrender." She felt, in the sealing of signatures, both the cost of letting go and the faint warmth of doing the right work. There were practical choices afterward that required more courage than she had imagined. The proceeds were not a fortune. They were enough to set up funds that could be used to help Roberto and to secure the children's schooling for a time. She met with Roberto's lawyer, an officious woman who made lists with a steady pencil, and agreed to create an account in the children's names with a caregiver trustee. She arranged a sum to be placed to help Roberto restart a small contracting gig that had faltered under the weight of his leaving. She did not hide it or present it as an exchange for affection. She signed the papers with a trembling hand and mailed copies, keeping nothing back in the shadow of calculation. Word moved, as it always did, with the cautious celerity of a town that needed time to absorb losses. When the papers arrived, Roberto read them with the slow, private processing of a man who had learned to put his heart in a drawer when it hurt. He called her once, briefly, to ask logistical questions about the account. "I'll make sure it's used for them," he said tersely. "I don't want anything else. I need space." It was not the embrace she had once imagined the night he had packed his tools and left. It was not an erasure of the past. It was a decision, a measure of boundaries he imposed to protect what remained. Soledad accepted it because the man at the door had taught her the first rule of repair. It is not for the perpetrator to dictate the terms of forgiveness. It is for the injured to choose. Her days found a rhythm between small tasks and bigger claims. She attended therapy with a counselor from the regional clinic, an unflashy woman who used gentle language to name patterns: anxious attachment, boundary erosion, projection. The therapy did not absolve her. It did, however, give her words that were not shaming.
In a support group at the parish basement, she sat with other women who had erred in the names of survival or fear. They traded stories about making amends and laughed at each other's clumsy apologies, and in the laughter there was something like relief. Soledad also began to work at the soup kitchen more regularly. Her hands, which had once used cleanliness to ward off anxiety, now ladled soup and distributed tortillas. The women who came in for plates did not always ask her name. Many had their own histories of small, unredeemed cruelties. Doña Esperanza worked alongside her, and, when the work paused, would press a piece of bread into her hand and say, "You did a thing others could not do." The sentence reached her like a small temperature. It did not fix everything, but it reminded her that action and contrition could coexist. Months moved in this way. Confessions, paperwork, therapy, small kindnesses, the steady administration of a new life that was not less filled, but filled differently. The house was gone. The bougainvilleas at the curb eventually found new owners who pruned and watered them and made them bloom once more. The town's whispers, which had been a kind of wind that flayed, softened into conversation that acknowledged mistake without welcoming the old habit of gossip. She visited the parish less as a person petitioning for absolution, and more as someone learning how to be part of a community again. Then the cough began, small at first, then more insistent. It was the sort of thing that elders in Tlaquepaque remark upon in the mercados with the same mix of concern and practical advice. "Drink this," they'd say, "wrap your throat." She saw the doctor when the cough would not subside. Tests followed with the patience of municipal bureaucracy. Forms filled, technicians in blue masks, the sterile clatter of hospital corridors. The diagnosis arrived in paper and measured sentences. The cardiologist used terms Soledad repeated like prayers because repetition made them more bearable. Congestive heart failure, risk factors, potential procedures. The prognosis was cautious. There was a possible intervention, but it carried the price of surgery and recovery that might require time and resources. The timing felt oddly like a ledger balancing. After the house sold and the accounts were set, After the funds were placed for the children, the body made its own claim. She sat with Father Mateo in the garden of the parish one afternoon, while the afternoon light turned the church bell rack into a silhouette. "If you have to choose," he said, fingers together, "we are called to both stewardship and mercy. Stewardship means we care for our bodies. Mercy means we honor those we have harmed. There can be a painful tension where both demands feel like they cannot be met. Pray, consult, and then choose. Carry the consequences." The choice was not dramatic. It was private, carried out with the small arithmetic of a life stripped to essentials. On one evening, when the rain turned the town's cobbles to mirrors, Roberto arrived and sat at the foot of her bed. For a long time he did not speak. The machines whispered their small beeps, and the room smelled faintly of antiseptic and lemon polish. He looked at her and held her hand, and in the holding there was a negotiation and a mercy. "I read your letters," he said finally, voice low. "I saw what you wrote on the pages. I do not know if I can forget. Perhaps I will never be that naive again. But I can see that you are trying. For your sake, for the children's, I want this to end with less pain." Soledad's response was small. "I cannot ask you to forgive me. I only wanted you to know the truth. I did not want them to find my work as if it were evidence." She breathed hard, and the machines marked the rhythm of her chest. "I am sorry," she added, the voice like a thread. "I am sorry for what I did. I wanted you close, and I did wrong to get it." Roberto leaned forward and, with an effort that looked like unlearning an old pattern of stoicism, he said something neither legal nor triumphant. "I forgive you in part," he said, "because holding the whole of it will make them all worse. I cannot promise full reconciliation, but I can promise I will try to be present now for them." It was a fragile thing, partial forgiveness. It was not the absolution of a movie. It was a human compromise that acknowledged harm and made space for repair nonetheless. Soledad accepted it like the mercies she had practiced in small doses at the parish kitchen. The grandchildren's visit that followed became the episode the town later referenced with the tenderness of people who have seen small lights in a long night. Miguelito came first, his backpack scratched from playgrounds, his face more solemn than his years warranted. He held a piece of paper in his hand, and when she asked what it was, he said shyly, "It's for school, Abuela. I wrote about you." His essay, scribbled in careful pencil, read like a small theology of children. He wrote about bugambilias, about how truth makes things heavy and light at the same time, about how sometimes people make mistakes and then try to mend them. He read the piece aloud in the hospital room, and his voice shook with the courage of a child who wants to help an adult heal. Sophia fidgeted, but then slipped a bracelet onto Soledad's wrist, bright beads that clicked softly. "Abuela," Sophia said, "we're okay. We are not mad like the others. We're just thinking." She did not say the full weight of a child's sense of loss. She simply offered herself, which had always been the better medicine. These small encounters were not instant atonement. The children's love, uncomplicated and literal, did not erase years of misdirection. But their presence was catalytic. It made Roberto softer in ways that frightened him, and made Soledad less inclined to perform remorse for an audience. In the smallness of bedside conversations, in the awkward jokes and shared silences, the family began to move, slowly and not in a straight line, toward a future that might hold room for both memory and care. The end came not as a dramatic thunderclap, but as a gentle dimming. After a night where the rain had tapped a slow rhythm on the window, Soledad grew quieter. Nurses adjusted blankets, and Doña Esperanza hummed hymns under her breath. Father Mateo sat in the chair and read short prayers, not long sermons. When the last hour arrived, Soledad opened her eyes and saw Roberto leaning close. There was a tenderness in the way he touched her hand, an unadorned human mercy. "I am sorry," Roberto said one last time, the phrase heavy with the weight of a son who had loved poorly and forgiven himself with work. "I wish things had been different." "So do I," she whispered. "I am glad you are here." Her breathing slowed, and in the quiet room lit by a lamp, she passed without fanfare. It was a death that bore the shape of the life she had lived, private, simple, and finally reconciled enough to allow the living to breathe. The funeral, held at the parish with its whitewashed walls and sunlit nave, was attended by a scattering of people who embodied the complicated geometry of a life. Neighbors who had once spread gossip came with folded hands. The young couple who had purchased the house sent a wreath. The soup kitchen women carried pans and whispered over coffee. Father Mateo's homily was measured. He spoke of truth and of the courage it takes to confess. He reminded those present that repentance does not erase harm, but that accountability and mercy may still dwell in the same heart. Roberto spoke at the graveside with the ropey voice of someone who had rebuilt his life in the ruins of love and had found a fragile architecture of care. He did not give a speech that absolved. He gave one that acknowledged both his mother's wrongdoing and her effort to repair. "We are all the sum of what we choose," he said. "We choose now to carry what remains with care." The children placed small stones on the gravestone, an old custom Soledad had taught them, and for a moment the dust on the mountain road seemed less hard. The stone that marked Soledad's resting place bore a simple epitaph. It was not a grand sentence, but a truth she had come to learn: loved enough to let go. The phrase fit the contour of her last years, an admission that love, at its truest, sometimes frees rather than clings. In the weeks that followed, life resumed that daily stubbornness of towns. The bugambillas, tended by the new owners of her former house, sent up new shoots. Miguelito's essay was read in school and then framed in the living room where he did his homework. Claudia, who had not needed to attend the funeral, sent a short note that asked for privacy and acknowledged the complexity of grief. Roberto took a week off work.
He visited the children's account, checked the balance, and began to make practical plans. He would not tell his son all the nuance of the past. There are some histories children must be spared until they are ready. But he would make sure the money was used for their futures. Months later, Doña Esperanza found a small notebook on a shelf in the parish basement and read Soledad's last entries. They were not dramatic. They were practical, full of lists and apologies and small plans for the money she left. She died as she lived, Doña Esperanza told a neighbor, tidy, practical, human. She did the work she could with the life she had. The epilogue of this local story came, as epilogues often do, from a small voice. Miguelito, now a teenager, wrote a short piece for a school assignment about family and truth. His teacher asked him to reflect on a story that had affected his life. He wrote of a grandmother who had held on too tightly and then learned to let go. He wrote of confession and of how a town can both wound and hold. He concluded with a sentence that seemed to carry the slow wisdom of children who have watched adults try their best. The truth hurts, but it can also teach you to plant. He signed his name and, in the margin, drew a tiny bugambilla. The story of Soledad Ramírez did not become a legend of miraculous reconciliation. It became something quieter, a parable many in Tlaquepaque repeated over coffee and in churchyard conversations as a caution and a comfort. They spoke of the danger of possessing love and of the patient work of repair. They spoke, too, of a visitor who turned on a television and showed a woman her life until she could not pretend it was otherwise. Some used that image to speak about conscience. Others used it to speak about grace. All agreed that truth had been the turning point, and that what followed required human courage, not miraculous fixes. People left her house tidier than before, or perhaps they returned to their own scrubbing with newly reflective hands. The children grew. Roberto learned to let his loyalties widen to include both tenderness for his mother's memory and a vigilance that would protect his own family. Claudia and he, bound now by the practicalities of co-parenting, found a new rhythm that kept the children's needs central without expecting the past to be undone. Forgiveness, when it came, arrived in increments. It arrived in less glamorous but steadier ways, a call to check on school fees, a shared meal at Christmas, a sometimes awkward hug at a birthday party. Not everything healed. Some things remained a scar, a memory that shaded certain rooms of the heart. As the town remembered the events, they used them to teach their children the hard arithmetic of human relationships. Truth needed to be told. Confession needed to be followed by action. Restitution could restore some possibilities, but not erase the past. People left her house tidier than before, or perhaps they returned to their own scrubbing with newly reflective hands. The children grew. Roberto learned to let his loyalties widen to include both tenderness for his mother's memory and a vigilance that would protect his own family. Claudia and he, bound now by the practicalities of co-parenting, found a new rhythm that kept the children's needs central without expecting the past to be undone. Forgiveness, when it came, arrived in increments. It arrived in less glamorous but steadier ways. A call to check on school fees, a shared meal at Christmas, a sometimes awkward hug at a birthday party. Not everything healed. Some things remained a scar, a memory that shaded certain rooms of the heart. As the town remembered the events, they used them to teach their children the hard arithmetic of human relationships. Truth needed to be told. Confession needed to be followed by action. Restitution could restore some possibilities, but not erase the past.
They taught that appearances of holiness were not the same as honesty, and that the person most desperate to be kept could sometimes be the one most dangerous to the ties they sought to preserve. At the edge of the plaza, where the light slants late in the afternoon and the church bells ring with their old cadence, a small plaque was sometimes pointed out to visitors by shopkeepers who liked to tell stories that had moral ends. There was a woman who kept a book, they would say, and in time she learned to set down the pen. The phrase became less a verdict and more a reminder that human lives are messy and that the work of making right is the daily labor of ordinary people. If this story has touched you, take a moment to reflect on the small things in your own life, where fear might have been disguised as care, where truth could free rather than shame. Share this story with someone who needs the reminder that repentance does not erase consequence, and that repair, when it comes, is slow and costly but not impossible. In the end, the truth was what started the change. It did not guarantee happiness or unbroken lives. It offered instead a difficult but honest route, naming what was broken, making reparation where possible, and trusting that human hearts, though fallible, can learn, slowly, to let go. A mother-in-law had, by her choices, helped break a marriage. A revelation had made the breaking visible. The work that followed, confession, restitution, therapy, and fragile reconciliation, was real work. It was the only way Soledad could meet the consequences of what she had done and, in her last years, try to leave behind something better for the grandchildren she loved. We do not end with a tidy moral. We end with the image of a small garden where bougainvilleas pushed through sun-warmed earth and, season by season, learned to bloom again. The flowers did not undo the past, but they offered the living a place to sit and remember the cost of deceit and the labor of making amends. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that truth matters, that confession is necessary but not sufficient, and that redemption, when it comes, asks for sacrifice without promising its audience a neat ending. Tell us in the comments what letting go has meant in your life, how truth opened a door you did not want to walk through, and what you found on the other side.